Hello, I am Dr. J Stewart, Executive Director of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Washington, D.C. I'm here to talk about my views on the trends in international trade and security as I sit here in Washington, D.C. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce some emerging challenges to export controls that I see. I will drill down into these challenges, including great power competition, the digitization of the economy, and human security. I will then talk about the implications of these trends as I see them with regards to the broadening of controls, the targeting of controls, and then draw some broader conclusions. Let me start with some context. We should keep in mind that since the end of the Cold War, export controls have effectively been a target-neutral mechanism to provide governments with visibility of trade in certain strategic goods. And by target neutral, I mean that the export controls have not been directed at any specific country or group of countries, as was the case during the Cold War. These post-Cold War controls have largely focused on weapons of mass destruction, conventional military weapons, and related technologies. In my view, a variety of factors are driving change to the nature of controls. As I see it, controls will become more targeted against specific countries and increasingly cover a broader range of international trade and commerce. Let me start with the first of the trends that I observe, which relates to what I would describe as anti-globalization and great power competition. During the Trump presidency in the United States, there was a so-called trade war, particularly between the US and China, which saw the leveraging of tariffs and other market-based elements to affect the level of bilateral trade between the two countries. That so-called trade war was, in my mind, part of a broader anti-globalization trend, which is more linked to economics than national security. This trend has been made worse by the effects of COVID-19, which will affect global supply chains and perhaps reset supply chains in a way that could not have been foreseen before COVID-19. The supply chains that emerged after the COVID-19 pandemic may look very different from the supply chains that existed before. This anti-globalization trend is connected with a second major trend that I observe, which relates to great power competition. Rising great power competition and concerns about the actions and approaches of specific countries, particularly China and Russia, are driving a particular evolution of controls driven by national security concerns. The Biden administration in the US is likely to take a very different approach with regards to the first of these two issues, that is, in relation to globalization and anti-globalization, where the Biden administration can be expected to be more open to the free movement of goods and people in the form of international trade. However, the Biden administration is likely to continue the same course with regards to the second of the issues related to great power competition, particularly in relation to China. Let's dive a little bit more deeply into the China concern. In my view, China is more driven by economic and security interests than it is driven by a need to project power abroad. However, the result is that China pursues an aggressive foreign policy and technology Indianization policy intended to fuel its rise as a great power. The result of this approach is that Western to China relations become a zero-sum game with a winner and a loser, as opposed to a cooperative relationship in a market structure. This is exemplified in a number of areas, including, for example, with regards to China's actions in the South China Sea. In this context, China's Belt and Road Initiative and other foreign actions are largely intended to provide resources, including rare earths, to support China's future growth. The initiative creates trade dependencies that suit China's economic interests both now and down the road, but these can often come out at the expense of the partner country. China uses all of the instruments of the state, which may be described as an authoritarian or totalitarian state in pursuit of its goals. This includes leveraging its corporate and private sector to acquire goods and technology from abroad for use in its strategic programs. This has been termed China military-civil fusion and was an important element of the Trump administration narrative with regards to China. As an authoritarian state, there is also concern about China's treatment of its own population, including in particular in relation to the internment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Next, let me turn to Russia. The Western-Russia dynamic is not a new one, even though Western-Russian relations somewhat eased for a period at the end of the Cold War. Russia is engaged in a wide range of activities that are of concern to the West, and that drives the targeting of controls against Russia. For example, Russia's support of the Assad regime in Syria is an example of Russian power projection into a troubled region. Russia has used chemical weapons and radiological weapons for assassination in at least Russia and the UK. Russia has also supported the Assad regime in Syria despite its continued use of chemical weapons. Russia has developed, tested and deployed some very concerning novel weapons systems that are particularly destabilizing, including in relation to nuclear weapons. Russia and NATO also continue to posture through exercises and other activities which are a cause of concern. Whilst I think the Russian challenge is secondary to the China challenge, what I observe is a continued move to increasingly target controls against Russian activity of concern. I have thus far focused primarily on the concerns posed by China and Russia and their implications for the evolution of controls, but let me broaden my aperture slightly. We must keep in mind that while the West has specific concerns with China and Russia in particular, both of those countries also have their own perceived security concerns that drive their own action. As a result of this, both countries take steps intended to evade Western controls, including efforts to acquire strategic technology from abroad through whatever means is available to them, so that they can become less reliant on international Western-oriented suppliers in the future. Both countries also implement export controls and other measures to control the export of strategic goods from their own territories. I believe China's new export control law, adopted late last year, was as much about managing its strategic trade with the West and the US in particular, as it was about the more traditional purposes of preventing WMD proliferation. My bottom line view is that the great power competition dynamic between the US, China and Russia will drive a global evolution of export controls and related measures. Let me turn to the second of the trends that I observe, which relates to the digitization of the economy. In addition to the power dynamics between key states, the nature of technology and commerce is also changing in a way that fundamentally affects trade and security. Much of commerce and technology is now digital and conducted via the internet. While superficially it can be argued that technology in any form was already subject to export control, the digitalization fundamentally challenges the effectiveness of controls. This is particularly true with regards to cyber espionage and cyber theft, both of which are undertaken by groups in Russia and China. As it stands, most countries do not require companies holding export control technology to implement any form of cybersecurity standard. Export controls only really come into play at the point of export. In my view, this is a glaring gap in the export control system, one which I hope we can see action on in the years ahead. Next, let me talk to the third challenge that I see, which relates to human security. Some countries have used export controls to protect human security in a relatively limited way for a number of decades. For example, in the UK, the export of torture equipment has been controlled for many years. The so-called Arab Spring saw the creation of a political movement to more fully leverage export controls in protecting human security. This primarily focused on a perceived need to control the export of cyber surveillance equipment to countries in the Middle East. This features in the EU's recent recast of the EU Export Control Regulation. This was an important focus of the EU's new Export Control Regulation, which is being adopted as we speak. Led by the EU example, there is now global interest in how export controls can promote human security. This has been raised in the context of China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for example. More work is needed to identify where export controls could contribute in relation to human security and how such controls can be effectively implemented. More work is needed to identify where export controls can contribute to human security and how such controls can be effectively implemented in practice. I've been talking largely to the targeting of controls around specific topics of concern to international peace and security. Let me now turn to how I see these challenges broadening the aperture of control. First, let me talk to the challenge of emerging technology and military end-use controls. Export controls, as formulated since the end of the Cold War, have largely focused on technologies with possible WMD and military applications. The effort by China and to some extent Russia to leverage all possible sources of technology to further its domestic aims has necessitated a rethinking of controls. As a result, controls are being placed on so-called emerging technologies, that is, technologies whose application to specific end uses of concern is less clear-cut. This could involve technologies with a lower Technology Readiness Level, TRL score, where TRLs are a measure of the readiness of a technology for a particular deployment. Such technology would usually not be subject to export control until there is a clear end use of concern. In the United States in particular, there has been a concerted effort to identify what emerging technologies need to be subject to enhanced controls, particularly when destined for destinations such as China. We should also keep in mind that even when accounting for emerging technologies, there are an infinite number of other items and technologies that could contribute to programs of concern. It's simply not practical to list all items that could contribute to programs of concern. As such, what I observe is that there is an increasing focus on the idea of listing end users of concern, for example, military end users of concern, that go beyond the existing export control regime lists of technologies and which go beyond the lists of sanctioned entities. The point here is that since not all technologies can be subject to control, and since sanctions lists can never be complete, what I observe is a trend towards listing entities of potential concern so that there is an enhanced level of scrutiny for all transactions involving those parties. There are different approaches to this. For example, list-based controls, catch-all controls, and other mechanisms that can be used. But it is notable that many countries did not, for example, have a military end-use control like the WMD end-use control, which now features widely in most export control systems. This latter point also, in my mind, highlights the importance of a closer coordination between export controls and sanctions measures, which I think it's fair to say have been relatively distinct instruments over the recent decades. Okay, I have talked through some of the challenges that I see, and I have described that I believe that controls will become both more targeted and broader. Let me now talk through some of the implications and what needs to be done in this context. The first point is that I think it's clear that global dynamics are going to drive the development of export controls in a relatively profound way. Controls will become broader and will become more targeted at specific end users and end uses of concern. There is already a lot of work being done on this topic, particularly in the US, but a lot more work needs to be done to understand the implications of this. At the national level, there is a need to ensure that countries have in place a control framework that responds to all aspects of the challenge. In my view, this means it is important to leverage all the tools available at the national level, including export controls, investment controls, and vetting controls. In my view, this means that at the national level, it becomes necessary to leverage and closely interlink a wide variety of tools. For example, export controls, investment controls, vetting controls, sanctions, and other measures which may have historically been relatively distinct instruments need to be leveraged to work together in unison to tackle some of the challenges that I've outlined. There is a need to ensure that countries have in place a control framework that responds to all aspects of the challenge. This includes leveraging all tools of government, export control, investment control, vetting controls, sanctions, financial controls, and other instruments, all working alongside each other to a common purpose, which is to prevent the abuse of trade in ways that would hinder international peace and security. Second, there is a need for countries to determine what emerging technologies should be controlled and how. What that looks like may vary from country to country. At the national level, it will also be necessary to develop a control approach to control digital export-controlled information, even when it is not being exported. That may include setting standards for those who hold export-controlled technologies in the country, say on a computer system or on a server. It will also be necessary at the national level to determine whether and how to incorporate human security elements within a national control framework. Next, let me talk about the implications of this to technology holders, to the private sector, to companies, research institutes, and other bodies who may engage in international trade in a more direct way than governments. In my view, these actors are critical and are going to face a challenging set of circumstances complying with an evolving set of controls. In my view, it will be important for these entities to develop and refine internal compliance program guidelines and policies to account for these changing dynamics. This may include addressing questions such as, what exposure do you have to countries of concern, including China and Russia, for example, to human security concerns, and to emerging technology concerns? What technologies do you hold in digital form, and what IT security standards can you put in place to safeguard it? What guidance, training material, and red flags should you be promulgating throughout your organization to account for these challenges? Finally, let me talk to what additional work I think we as export control practitioners have ahead of us in the future. And here I include my own work as a scholar working in this area. First, I think it's necessary for us to map out strategic technology supply chains, particularly in relation to China and Russia, to understand the nature of strategic trade. Mapping out strategic technology supply chains will provide insight into what types of technology are being targeted by countries of concern, through which routes, and what can be done to prevent the illicit transfer of strategic technologies. Second, I think there is a need to develop sectoral guidance that reflects the changing nature of export controls. By that, I mean that I think there's a need to develop guidance that goes beyond the more traditional purposes of export controls, which relate to WMD proliferation concerns and military proliferation concerns. Companies on the front line are having to work through the challenge of how do you balance trade with the US and trade with China in the current security context. Finally, I think there's a need to work with foreign partners to help governments account for these challenges and to inform the private sector about what needs to be done. So in conclusion, let me sum up. I believe that there are a variety of factors driving the evolution of export controls. The result is that export controls will become both broader and more targeted against specific areas of concern. These challenges will result in many countries updating their approach to export controls. Companies will need to adapt by understanding where their work relates to an area of concern and putting in place appropriate internal controls. There is a lot of work that needs to be done to understand the implications of this, including a need to develop sectoral guidance. Thank you for allowing me to share my views with you. I wish you well with the conference.